Let's continue studying Golden Doves. This is class 165. We're on the bottom of page 92. We're dealing with the style of the Mishnah and how the Mishnah was edited by Rabbeinu HaKadosh with a view to the fact that the Mishnah was to be studied by heart, and if you're going to study something by heart, the style and the particular words chosen should preferably have a certain rhythm, a certain rhyme, a certain consistency from a phonetic perspective that would enable, or that would facilitate rather, the learning of these of this material, of this composition, the Al-Peh, by heart. So the style of the Mishnah also is affected by the fact that it depended on memorization. Within the limits of our study, it will be sufficient to examine a single instance concerning the revision and correction of an original version of the Mishnah. To understand this, it's important that you know that Rabbeinu HaKadosh sat down with his betin, and they edited the Mishnah, and the composition of the Mishnah was agreed to by Rabbeinu HaKadosh uBetino. This was known as the Mahadora Kama. The Mahadora Kama was the original version of the Mishnah that Rabbeinu HaKadosh edited and that the Betin agreed to. Later on, there was a Mahadora Batra, which is to say that Rabbeinu HaKadosh sat with the Betin a second time and they wanted to make certain corrections or emendations to the Mishnah. Now, the problem that we're going to be dealing with is as follows. The Mishnah was studied by heart. So the first version of the Mishnah was already studied by heart. How do you unstudy by heart something that you already studied? Now, obviously, the differences were minor between the first and second versions. But nevertheless, the second version was the accepted version. It was meant to supplant the first version. It's very hard to remember things by heart in that way, meaning if you study something by heart and now you have it ingrained in your memory, and now you say, wait, you're going to change a few words there. So, eventually you begin to doubt which was the first version, which was the second version. It's not so simple. So let's deal with that now. Within the limits of our study, it will be sufficient to examine a single instance concerning the revision and correction of an original version of the Mishnah, the Mahadora Kama. Rabbi Emmanuel Haili, one of my father's favorite mefarshim on the Mishnayot, one of the most perceptive Talmudists of his time, from Italy, pointed out the difficulty of amending an oral text. How do you change an oral text which is already studied by heart? He noted that unlike a written text which could be corrected in a later, more authoritative version, okay, if it's a writing, it's not a problem. Just rewrite it and that's it. The second writing will automatically supplant the first writing. That's not a problem. But an oral text, memorized from early youth and constantly repeated in the schools, was much more difficult to discard in favor of a revised version. He observed that memorization of the revised version would not solve the problem. So he said, okay, study now the new version by heart. Everybody studies the new version by heart. You think it's over. It's not over. Since it would only be a matter of time before conflict arose as to which version was faulty and which one was revised, right? So instead, I'm just moving for a second to get myself a cup of water. So instead, the original version, Mishnah Rishonah, was left unchanged. So, and an explanation was made to circulate concerning the validity of that version. So oftentimes you see in the Gemara that the Gemara will refer to the fact that there is a Baraita that explains the Mishnah, and the Baraita that explains the Mishnah, it provides an explanation that is not in accordance with the actual text of the Mishnah. So what's happening, according to the Rabbi Emmanuel Haili, and this is correct, is that the Rabbeinu HaKadosh didn't want to just change the original text of the Mishnah with the new text of the Mishnah. That was not what he wanted to do, because he would have the problem of trying to study it by heart. So what he did instead was, he made a note. It was like a footnote, a baraita, which was appended, so to speak, to the Mishnah, which the Gemara brings. And that baraita provides an explanation to the original text. The explanation supplants the original text because it says, the text says ABC, but it actually means ABD, right? So that's the strategy. Now you understand why it was done that way, right? He observed The memorization of the revised version would not solve the problem, since it would only be a matter of time before conflict arose as to which version was faulty and which one was revised. Right. Instead, I'm sorry, got this right. Instead, the original version was left unchanged, and an explanation was made to circulate concerning the validity of that version, and that explanation was then brought by the Gemara. Gradually, the original version would be weakened and eventually supplanted by the revised version. So now that you're studying ABC, but you're told ABC means ABD, ABC means ABD, and then eventually you learn ABD, and then you begin to learn ABD. You learn the text ABD, and then like that, the second version, it eventually supplants the first. It's really quite remarkable. This is a remarkable perceptive explanation. Right? Traces of this type of emendation and their effect on style are evident in the Mishnah. For example, Bava Mesi'ah, chapter 4, Mishnah Aleph. It says, Hazahav koneh et hakesef. Gold coins can acquire silver coins. The hakesef eno koneh et hazahav. But silver coins cannot acquire gold coins. Hanechoshet koneh et hakesef. It's koneh, yeah. The hakesef eno koneh et hanechoshet. Okay. The Palestinian and Babylonian Talmud report that the original version taught. Let me first explain this Mishnah to you. Okay. So in Dinei Mamonot, in Jewish law, if somebody buys something from someone else, so let's say that Reuven tells Shimon, I want to buy that cup. So Reuven gives Shimon $1 for the cup. The question is, at what moment in time does the transfer of ownership of the cup take place? So, not going into all the details, but the law is, at least the Rabbanan, at least according to the Yohanan, because the Shakish says it's the Oraita, but okay. The law is that the transfer of ownership of the cup does not take place from the moment of paying for the cup. It takes place from the moment that the cup is physically taken possession of by the buyer. So from the moment that the buyer physically takes possession of the cup, let's say by lifting it up, at that moment, the buyer becomes the owner of the cup, and then you can't rescind the transaction. But let's say, for example, I think who is the buyer again? Let's say Reuven is the buyer and Shimon is the seller. Okay, Reuven gives Shimon $1, and then Shimon says, "You know what? I changed my mind. I don't want to sell you the cup." According to Halacha, Reuven still doesn't own the cup, so Shimon can give him back the $1, and the deal is rescinded. Now, so we see that chattel, movable property, closes a transaction. So in the sense, the lifting up of the movable property makes the money now owned by the seller, right? And the chattel now owned by the buyer. So when the Mishnah says, Hazahav koneh et hakesef, it's, let's say I'm exchanging one type of currency for another type of currency. So the question is, well, there's no chattel here, right? Apparently. So if there's no chattel, at what point is the transaction closed? So it says if you have two types of currency, let's say you have gold coins and you have silver coins. Since the silver coins are more fungible, in the sense that they're easier to exchange, you give somebody a silver coin, they'll take it, they'll accept it, right? A gold coin is harder to deal with. So I say, I don't want a gold coin, I'm going to have to give you all my change now, but for the gold, you pay me with gold, pay me with silver. So the gold relative to the silver is considered to be chattel, and therefore hazahav koneh et hakesef means from the moment that the person receiving the gold takes physical possession of the gold, at that moment the deal is closed, and now the kesef is acquired by the other side, right? Hazahav koneh et hakesef, the hakesef eno koneh et hazahav. But if a person took possession of the silver and the other person didn't take possession of the gold, the transaction is not closed. It could still be rescinded. Now, let's say we're dealing with copper and silver. Copper also is considered less fungible for reasons discussed by the Gemara. It doesn't matter what the reason is now. And therefore, if you take possession of the nechoshet, which is less fungible, and therefore it's not considered money relative to kesef, right? So for the moment that the person taking possession of the nechoshet takes possession of it, the deal is closed and it can't be rescinded. They have kesef and okonet nechoshet, but the other way around, for the moment that the person takes possession of the silver, the transaction is not closed and it could still be rescinded because the silver is considered money. And as we said, the moment of paying the money is not the moment of closing the transaction, right? There is no transfer of ownership yet at that point. Again, the Rabbanan, according to Rabbi Yochanan, halacha like Rabbi Yochanan. Okay. So that's a Mishnah. The Palestinian Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the Palestinian Talmud both report that the original version taught by the Biudanasi read, silver coins can acquire gold coins. Originally it was Hakesef koneh et hazahav, but gold coins cannot acquire silver coins. The hazahav eno koneh et hakesef, the exact opposite, right? So again, the Gemara says that the Mahadora Kama was Hakesef koneh et hazahav, the hazahav eno koneh et hakesef. The Palestinian Talmud recounts that when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi reported the revised version to his son Shimon, his son rejected it, replying, I won't change my version since when you had your strength, you had taught me silver coins can acquire gold coins. So he goes to his son. His son said, Daddy, when you were strong and intellectually at your peak, you told me that a kesef koneh et zahav. I'm not going to change that. That's how fanatic people were about studying by heart, right? The text of the Mishnah, so you couldn't change the text. You can't just change the text, right? It's ingrained in the memory. The text of the Mishnah, of the printed edition of the Palestinian Talmud, corresponds to the original version. And that's why, if you look at the Talmud Yerushalmi, it has the Mahadora Kama. In the printed editions in manuscript of the Babylonian Talmud, the Mishnah corresponds to the revised version. But if you look at the old Kitvei Yad of the Babylon Talmud Bavi, they have the Mahadora Batra. So you see the evolution of the Mishnah and how it didn't just immediately say, okay, here's a new text of the Mishnah. There was a progress because the Babylonian Talmud was closed after the Palestinian Talmud. It's kind of funny that everybody used the word Palestinian to refer to the land of Israel, and suddenly today Palestinian becomes referring to a nation that never existed. But okay, whatever. Sorry, I digressed into politics. I apologize. Okay, there is no evidence, however, that the revised version had in fact displaced the original version in Talmudic times. No evidence to that. We know that certainly at the point of the closing of the Yerushalmi, the Ma'adora Batra, the second version, did not supplant yet the first version. Two Babylonian scholars, Rabbi Higya and Rav Asher, defended the original version. Finally, as indicated by Riki, Emmanuel Hayrike, a careful analysis of the revised version will reveal that it does not fit with the rest of the Mishnah. And by the way, the revised version, it doesn't fit with the rest of the Mishnah. The revised version makes no sense in listing gold and copper coins separately. It should have read, gold and copper coins can acquire silver coins. Meaning the revised, if the revised version was actually the version of the Mishnah as originally drafted or edited by the Beno HaKadosh, it would say, Hazahav v'hanechoshet koneh et hakesef, the en hakesef koneh et hazahav et hanechoshet. Why be so verbose? Hazahav koneh et hakesef, right? The en hakesef koneh et hazahav. And then you said, hanechoshet koneh et hakesef, en hakesef koneh et hanechoshet. You could have just combined it to one sentence, but you couldn't, right? Because originally it was hakesef koneh et hazahav, not hazahav koneh et hakesef, right? You understand? So that's why it was two sentences originally. But in the new version, where it's just in the new version where we kept the two sentences, right? But it doesn't make sense. It should have been one sentence. Copper coins can acquire silver coins, but silver coins can acquire copper coins. In the original version, silver in the first clause is the instrument of acquisition, whereas in the second clause, it is the object of acquisition. So you say, Hazahav, I'm sorry, according to the original version, Hakesef koneh et hazahav, the silver acquires the gold, right? Then hazahav koneh et hakesef. And then you said, Hanehoshet koneh et hakesef, ve'en hakesef koneh et hanehoshet. That's why you need to have two clauses. So the two clauses makes perfect sense, or two sentences makes perfect sense in the context of the original version. It is therefore evident that the revised version of Yehuda Nasi was never edited into the text of the Mishnah. So they never really fully edited the Mishnah. They really fully edited the Mishnah. The Mishnah would have said, Hazahav ve'hanehoshet koneh et hakesef, which it doesn't say, right? So what they did instead was, because there was resistance to changing the text so dramatically, they created this Baraita, which interprets the Mishnah, and then little by little, the Mishnah was revised, but even when it was revised, it wasn't revised in such an eloquent fashion. This illustrates resistance of the original text to revision, even when attempted by the original author himself, Rabbeinu HaKadosh.